I found out that my husband is planning to make my daughter his retirement plan. My daughter Claire was 17 and had just gotten into pre-med when my husband Richard sat me down with a spreadsheet showing how her future doctor salary would support us for 30 years. And I thought he was joking until I saw he'd calculated everything down to which specialty would pay us the most. Surgeons make $700,000 a year. If Claire goes into neurosurgery, we can retire at 55 and travel the world. He had graphs and projections and retirement communities picked out, all funded by my daughter, who wasn't even his biological child. Richard, she's going to have her own life, her own family, her own expenses. He waved his hand dismissively. That's why I've been talking to her about staying single. Relationships are distractions. She needs to focus on maximizing her earning potential for the family. He'd been poisoning my daughter against relationships so she'd have more money for him. You've been telling her not to date? He nodded proudly. I told her about all my friends whose careers were ruined by marriage. She's smart. She gets it. No husband means more money for her real family. Claire's real family was me and her. Richard had married me 3 years ago and immediately started calling himself her father, even though she'd asked him not to. She's not your retirement account, Richard. He pulled out more papers. Actually, legally, she kind of is. I've been supporting her for 3 years. That creates an obligation. My lawyer says we could sue for parental support based on established dependency. I stared at him. You've talked to a lawyer about suing my teenage daughter for money she hasn't even earned yet? He shrugged, planning ahead. Also, I've been keeping receipts for everything I buy her. Food, clothes, school supplies. It's all documented as loans she'll need to repay. He showed me a folder labeled Claire's Debt, with 3 years of grocery receipts where he'd calculated her portion of every meal. She owes us $32,000 so far. With interest, it'll be $40,000 by the time she graduates. My daughter didn't owe him anything. I paid for everything from my salary and my ex-husband's child support. That's my money you're counting. Not yours. Richard laughed. We're married. Your money is my money, and I've been smart about it. Every check you've written for her has my name on the memo line as co-provider. I looked at our bank statements, and he was right. He'd been adding his name to everything, creating a paper trail that he was supporting her. She's 17. She can't owe you money for living in her own home. But Richard had an answer ready. She's almost 18. Adults pay rent. I've already drawn up a rental agreement for her birthday. $600 a month or she moves out. Claire was planning to live at home during college to save money. I won't let you charge my daughter rent. Richard stood up and walked to the window. Then she can live with her deadbeat father. Oh wait, he lives in a studio apartment. No room for her there. He'd researched my ex-husband's living situation. Here's the beautiful part. Medical school costs $300,000. I'll co-sign her loans, but she'll sign a contract that 60% of her salary goes to us until we die. It's fair considering we raised her. We didn't raise her. I raised her for 14 years before Richard showed up. She'll never agree to that. Richard smiled. She will when it's the only way to get loans. I've already hurt her credit a little bit. Opened a card in her name and missed some payments. Not enough to ruin her, but enough that she'll need a co-signer. My blood went cold. You committed identity theft against my child? He shook his head. I helped establish her credit history. The missed payments were teaching moments about financial responsibility. He'd sabotaged my daughter's future to control her. I'm calling the police. But Richard grabbed my phone. And tell them what? That your husband planning for retirement? That he's been financially responsible? Claire won't contradict me. She loves her stepdaddy. He was wrong about that. Claire tolerated him for my sake, but she didn't love him. That night, I told Claire everything while Richard was at his bowling league. She was horrified. He's been tracking what I eat? He thinks I'm going to support him? I showed her the spreadsheets and the debt folder and the credit cards he'd opened. We need to leave Mom. Tonight. We packed what we could fit in my car. Claire grabbed her important documents and school stuff. I took my jewelry and family photos, and the evidence of what Richard had been planning. We drove to my sister's house 2 states away. Richard called 20 minutes after he got home. Where's my retirement plan? I hung up on him and turned my phone off. Amy was already pulling sheets out of the hall closet and making up the guest room bed. Claire sat on the couch hugging her backpack and looking smaller than she had in years. My phone buzzed against the coffee table where I'd set it down. Richard's name flashed on the screen 17 more times over the next hour, while Amy showed us where the towels were and brought us extra blankets. I watched the calls come in and didn't answer any of them. The voicemail notification appeared around midnight. I turned the volume up just enough to hear Richard's voice threatening to call the police and report Claire as a runaway. He said she was still a minor and I had no legal right to take her across state lines without his permission. Amy grabbed my phone and deleted the message. She reminded me that Claire turned 18 in 3 weeks, and Richard had zero legal claim to her anyway. We finished unpacking the car, and I finally powered my phone completely off. The next morning, Amy handed me a printed list of family law attorneys in the area who offered free consultations. I called the first name on the list while Claire was still asleep. Scarlett O'Sullivan answered on the second ring and listened to me explain everything without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before telling me this wasn't just a bad marriage. She said what Richard had done was financial abuse and identity theft. She asked if I'd brought any of Richard's documents with me. I told her about the spreadsheets and the debt folder and the credit card statements. Scarlett said I needed to come in that afternoon and bring everything. I met with Scarlett at 2 o'clock in a small office that smelled like coffee and old carpet. She spread Richard's documents across her desk and photographed every page with her phone. She explained that Richard could destroy evidence or claim I'd stolen marital property if we didn't document everything right away. She walked me through uploading all the photos to a secure cloud storage account she set up for me. She made me change all my passwords to things Richard would never guess. She said we needed to move fast before Richard figured out what we were doing. The whole process took 90 minutes, and by the end I had copies of everything stored in 3 different places. Claire and I drove to the police station after leaving Scarlett's office. The building was gray concrete with flags out front and a parking lot that was mostly empty. We walked inside and asked to speak to someone about identity theft. The officer at the front desk called for Detective Gregory Ahn, who came out 10 minutes later carrying a notepad. He led us to a small room with a table and 4 chairs. I showed him the credit card statements with Claire's name on accounts she'd never opened. Detective Ahn looked at Claire's birth date on her driver's license and then back at the account opening dates. He said this was a clear case of fraud against a minor. He asked Claire to write out a statement describing what Richard had told her about managing her credit. She wrote for 20 minutes while the detective made copies of all the documents. Detective Ahn explained that because Claire was only 17 when Richard opened the accounts, the credit card companies would likely void the debt completely once they saw our police report. He said this was the first good news we'd had since leaving. He gave us a case number and told us to contact the credit bureaus immediately. He said he'd be in touch once he reviewed everything, and that we'd done the right thing by reporting it. Claire looked relieved for the first time in 2 days. We stopped for coffee on the way back to Amy's house, and she actually smiled when I ordered her favorite drink. I called my bank from Amy's kitchen table while Claire was in the shower. The representative helped me open a new account in just my name and transferred half of our joint savings before Richard could touch it. Scarlett had told me I was legally entitled to half of all marital assets. The amount was less than I'd hoped, but more than enough to get us started. I set up online access and changed all the security questions to things Richard wouldn't know. The whole process took 40 minutes. I felt like I was stealing even though Scarlett had assured me this was completely legal. Richard discovered the money transfer within 3 hours. My phone started buzzing with text messages even though I'd blocked his number. They came through as notifications from an unknown sender. He called me a thief in the first message. The second one said I'd stolen his retirement fund. The messages kept coming, each one angrier than the last. By the time I showed them to Scarlett, she'd received 27 texts in 90 minutes. She told me to save everything and not respond to any of it. She said his threats were evidence of his controlling behavior and would help our case. She asked if I wanted to file for a restraining order. I told her yes. Claire's phone rang while we were making dinner. She looked at the screen and then at me. It was her dad, Jeremy, calling. She'd texted him earlier about what happened. I nodded and she answered. I could hear Jeremy's voice through the phone, loud and angry. He said he couldn't believe Richard had targeted his daughter financially. Claire started crying and told him about the debt folder and the credit cards. Jeremy asked to talk to me. He told me he'd help however he could, including letting Claire stay with him if she needed space. He said his studio apartment wasn't much, but he'd make it work. I thanked him and handed the phone back to Claire. Claire talked to her dad for over an hour sitting on Amy's back porch. I watched through the kitchen window as she paced back and forth with the phone pressed to her ear. When she came back inside, her eyes were red, but she looked lighter somehow. She said they'd had the most honest conversation they'd had in years. Jeremy had admitted his studio apartment wasn't ideal, but he was already looking at 2-bedroom places, so Claire would have her own space when she visited. He'd apologized for not being around more when she was younger. Claire said it felt good to know her dad actually cared about her future, instead of trying to profit from it. Amy requested a week off work the next morning. She came home with legal pads and colored pens and spread them across the dining room table. Next, we spent the whole day making lists of everything we needed to do. Legal stuff went on one list with items like file for divorce and get restraining order and report identity theft. Financial stuff went on another list with open new bank account and cancel joint credit cards and change direct deposit. Practical stuff went on a third list with find apartment and transfer utilities and update mailing address. By dinner time, we had 3 full pages of tasks and a timeline for completing each one. Amy color-coded everything by priority. Red for urgent, yellow for important, green for when we had time. Almost everything was red. Scarlett called the next morning while I was making breakfast and told me to come to her office right away. She'd reviewed all the documents I sent and wanted to file the emergency divorce petition that afternoon. Claire stayed at Amy's house while I drove downtown to Scarlett's office building. The receptionist led me to a small conference room where Scarlett had spread out all the evidence across a long table. She pointed at Richard's spreadsheets and said these proved financial abuse and predatory behavior toward a minor. The restraining order petition was already drafted and ready for my signature. I read through 6 pages of legal language describing Richard's threats, his debt folder, and his identity theft against Claire. Seeing it all written out in formal legal terms made it feel more real and more terrifying. Scarlett explained the judge would review our petition within 48 hours and decide whether to grant a temporary order. The full hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, where Richard could argue against making it permanent. I signed everything with shaking hands, and Scarlett promised to file it all before the courthouse closed that day. She told me to expect Richard to react badly when he got served with papers, and to document any contact he tried to make. I went back to work the following Monday because I couldn't afford to take more time off. My coworker Maurice stopped by my desk around 10 in the morning with coffee and asked if I was okay. I looked that bad, apparently. I gave him the short version about leaving Richard and filing for divorce. Maurice nodded slowly and said he'd always thought Richard seemed controlling, but hadn't wanted to overstep by saying anything. I asked what he meant by controlling. Maurice reminded me about the company holiday party 2 years ago, when Richard had cornered him by the bar. I barely remembered Richard talking to Maurice that night. Maurice said Richard had spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about my salary, my benefits package, and whether I was up for any promotions soon. At the time, Maurice thought Richard was just making conversation, but looking back, it seemed like Richard was calculating my worth. I felt sick realizing Richard had been gathering financial information about me from the very beginning. Maurice apologized for not mentioning it sooner, but said he figured married couples talked about money stuff. I told him it wasn't his fault and thanked him for telling me now. Maurice squeezed my shoulder and said if I needed anything to just ask. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but kept thinking about Richard interrogating my coworkers about my income. Claire had an appointment with Tabitha Wheeler on Wednesday afternoon. Amy drove her to the credit counseling office while I was at work. Tabitha specialized in identity theft cases and came highly recommended by Scarlett. I got home from work to find Claire sitting at Amy's kitchen table with a folder full of paperwork. She looked exhausted, but relieved. Tabitha had walked her through filing disputes with all 3 credit bureaus and placing fraud alerts on her credit file. The fraud alerts would require any lender to verify Claire's identity before opening new accounts in her name. Tabitha had also helped Claire draft letters to the credit card companies explaining the identity theft and requesting removal of the accounts from her credit report. Claire showed me copies of everything she'd signed and sent. The process seemed overwhelming, but Tabitha had broken it down into manageable steps with clear deadlines for each one. Claire said Tabitha was confident the credit card companies would remove the fraudulent accounts once they saw the police report. I hugged my daughter and told her how proud I was of her for handling this so maturely. She said she just wanted it over with, so she could focus on college instead of Richard's mess. The credit card companies responded faster than expected. 2 of them called within a week to say they'd completed their investigations and were closing the accounts immediately. The fraudulent charges would be removed from Claire's credit report within 30 days. Claire cried with relief when she got the second call. The 3rd credit card company sent a letter requesting additional documentation, including a copy of Claire's birth certificate and the police report. Tabitha said this was normal and helped Claire gather everything they needed. The company seemed cooperative, and Tabitha expected them to close the account within another 2 weeks. Claire checked her credit report obsessively every few days, watching for the accounts to disappear. I told her to be patient, but I understood her anxiety. Richard had violated her trust and her future in the worst possible way. Richard's lawyer contacted Scarlett the same week trying to negotiate. The lawyer left a voicemail saying Richard just wanted to help plan for the family's future and suggesting marriage counseling instead of divorce. Scarlett called me immediately and asked if I wanted to consider counseling. I told her absolutely not. Richard had committed identity theft against my daughter and threatened us both. There was nothing to counsel. Scarlett said she'd expected that answer and had already prepared her response. She sent Richard's lawyer copies of every spreadsheet showing Claire's projected earnings, photos of the debt folder with grocery receipts, and documentation of the credit cards Richard opened fraudulently. She also included transcripts of his threatening text messages. Richard's lawyer went completely silent for 3 days after receiving that package. Scarlett said the evidence was so damning that the lawyer probably advised Richard to accept whatever terms we offered. I felt a small sense of victory knowing Richard's plan had been exposed to his own legal representation. The restraining order hearing happened on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after we filed. Scarlett told me to dress conservatively and let her do most of the talking. Claire came with us for moral support, even though she wasn't required to testify. We arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early and sat on a bench outside the courtroom. Richard showed up 15 minutes before the hearing with his lawyer looking calm and reasonable in a navy suit. He didn't look at us, but I could feel his presence like a weight in the hallway. The bailiff called our case and we filed into the courtroom. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked tired and impatient. Scarlett presented our evidence methodically, starting with Richard's threatening messages. The judge read several texts aloud in a flat voice asking where his retirement plan was and calling me a thief. Richard's mask slipped when he heard his own words read back. He interrupted the judge to say I'd taken his money and she needed to understand the context. The judge told him sharply to be quiet, or she'd hold him in contempt. His lawyer put a hand on Richard's arm, but Richard shook him off and kept talking. He said I'd stolen marital assets and turned his stepdaughter against him after everything he'd done for us. The judge's expression went from tired to disgusted. The judge asked to see the debt folder Scarlett had mentioned in our petition. Scarlett handed over the original folder with 3 years of grocery receipts. The judge flipped through page after page of Richard's calculations, showing Claire's portion of every meal down to the penny. She looked up at Richard and asked if he seriously expected a teenage girl to repay him for food she ate while living in her own home. Richard said Claire needed to learn financial responsibility and understand that nothing in life was free. The judge closed the folder and granted a temporary restraining order effective immediately. Richard had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, Claire, and Amy's house. He couldn't contact any of us directly or through third parties. The order would remain in effect until the final divorce hearing. Richard started to argue again, but his lawyer finally got him to shut up. We left the courtroom while Richard was still trying to explain his position to a judge who'd already made her ruling. Claire grabbed my hand in the hallway and squeezed hard. Detective On called my cell phone that afternoon while we were driving back to Amy's house. He said the credit card investigation had confirmed that Richard forged Claire's signature on all 3 applications. The handwriting analysis was conclusive, and the credit card companies had provided copies of the original applications. Detective On had forwarded everything to the district attorney's office for review. The DA was considering criminal charges for identity theft and fraud. Detective On warned me that criminal cases moved slowly, and it might be months before any charges were filed. He also said Richard would likely try to negotiate a plea deal rather than go to trial. I thanked him for the update and promised to cooperate with whatever the DA needed. Claire heard the whole conversation on speakerphone and looked both scared and satisfied. She asked if Richard would actually go to jail. I told her I didn't know, but at least there would be consequences for what he'd done to her. Amy started calling therapists the next day and found one who specialized in financial abuse. Peyton Grimes had an opening that week, and I took it even though the appointment was during work hours. Maurice covered for me without asking questions. Peyton's office was in a small building near the courthouse with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that made me feel less exposed. She was maybe 40 with kind eyes and a notepad she barely used because she just listened while I talked. I told her everything about Richard's spreadsheets and debt folders and how he'd sabotaged Claire's credit. Peyton nodded like she'd heard versions of this story before. She explained that financial abuse followed patterns, and Richard had checked almost every box. The control started small with little comments about my spending habits that seemed helpful at first. Then he inserted himself into my financial decisions by offering to help manage our accounts. Before I knew it, he was tracking every dollar and making me feel guilty for basic purchases. Peyton said the escalation was textbook, and the retirement plan scheme was just the final stage where he tried to lock down future income streams. I asked how I didn't see it happening, and Peyton said that was the point. Abusers worked slowly, so victims normalized each new level of control. She pulled out a chart showing typical progression, and I recognized every single stage. Richard had isolated me from friends by creating financial emergencies whenever we had plans. My best friend from college stopped inviting me to dinners because I always canceled last minute. Richard would suddenly need money for car repairs or his mother's medical bills right before I was supposed to go out. I thought I was being a good wife by prioritizing his needs, but he was actually preventing me from having support systems outside our marriage. Peyton asked about my other relationships, and I realized Richard had damaged most of them. My brother stopped calling after Richard made comments about him being irresponsible with money. My coworkers kept their distance because Richard would show up at work events and monopolize conversations about finances. Even Jeremy had pulled back further than necessary because Richard made every interaction awkward by questioning his child support payments. Peyton said rebuilding those connections would take time, but people who really cared would understand once they knew the truth. Claire filled out scholarship applications at the kitchen table while Amy made dinner. The financial aid office at her university had been incredibly helpful once Claire explained the identity theft situation. The counselor gave her special forms for students with unusual circumstances and helped document everything properly. Claire needed letters explaining why Richard's income couldn't be counted and why her credit had been damaged through no fault of her own. The counselor said Claire's case was unusual but not impossible, and the university had funds specifically for students escaping abusive situations. Claire wrote an essay about financial manipulation and educational goals that made Amy cry when she read it. The counselor thought Claire had a strong chance at several need-based scholarships because her grades were excellent and her situation was compelling. Claire applied to 15 different programs over 3 days. Each application required slightly different essays and documentation, but Claire attacked them with the same focus she brought to her pre-med classes. She said filling out applications felt like taking control of her future back from Richard. Every scholarship she applied for was money he couldn't claim or calculate or add to his retirement spreadsheets. Jeremy called Claire that weekend and asked if she wanted to get coffee. They met at a place near campus and talked for 2 hours about college and her major and what kind of doctor she wanted to be. Then Jeremy told her he'd found a 2-bedroom apartment and wanted to know if she'd consider living with him during college instead of staying in dorms. Claire was quiet for a long time. Jeremy said he knew he hadn't been around much when she was younger, but he wanted to make up for that now. He'd already signed the lease and set up the 2nd bedroom as hers with a desk and good lighting for studying. Claire could come and go as she pleased, and he wouldn't charge rent or expect her to cook or clean beyond basic respect for shared space. He just wanted her to have a stable home that was truly hers without strings attached. Claire cried and hugged him in the middle of the coffee shop. She told me later that it was the first time she'd felt like her dad actually saw her as a person, instead of an obligation. Jeremy's apartment was nothing fancy, but it was clean and quiet and close to campus. Claire moved in 2 weeks later with Amy's help while I was at work. Jeremy bought her a mini fridge for her room and a coffee maker because she'd mentioned liking coffee while studying. Amy, Claire, and I started apartment hunting the following weekend with a budget based solely on my salary. It felt strange at first to calculate what I could afford without Richard's voice in my head, telling me I was bad with money. Amy helped me make spreadsheets that actually made sense instead of Richard's manipulative projections. We looked at places near Claire's university so she could visit easily and close to my work so I wouldn't waste money on gas. Most landlords wanted proof of income and references, which I had from my job. Some wanted to see my husband's income too, until I explained I was separated and filing for divorce. One landlord got uncomfortable and said he didn't rent to people with unstable situations. Amy told him his loss and we left. We saw 12 apartments in 2 weeks. Some were too expensive, some were in bad neighborhoods, some were fine, but felt wrong. Then we found a 2-bedroom place on the 3rd floor of an older building with hardwood floors and big windows. The landlord was a woman in her 60s who owned the building and lived on the 1st floor. She asked about my situation and I told her the truth about leaving Richard. She said her daughter had escaped an abusive marriage years ago, and she understood how hard it was to start over. She didn't require Richard's income verification or ask invasive questions about the divorce. The rent was at the top of my budget but manageable and included heat, which would save money in winter. Claire loved the 2nd bedroom, which had a window seat perfect for reading. Amy said the neighborhood was safe and close to good grocery stores. We signed the lease that afternoon. Richard violated the restraining order 3 days before we were supposed to move. I was at work processing invoices when Maurice came to my desk looking worried. He said someone was in the lobby asking for me and security was dealing with it. I knew immediately it was Richard. Maurice walked with me to the lobby where 2 security guards had Richard cornered near the elevators. Richard was arguing that he had a right to talk to his wife about marital assets. The head of security was explaining that there was a restraining order, and Richard needed to leave immediately. Richard saw me and started yelling about how I'd stolen his retirement plan and turned his daughter against him. Maurice pulled out his phone and called the police while I stood there frozen. Richard kept yelling even as security physically escorted him toward the exit. He said I'd regret this, and he'd make sure I got nothing in the divorce, and Claire would see what kind of mother abandons her family. The police arrived within 10 minutes and arrested Richard right there in the parking lot. The security footage showed him entering the building and refusing to leave when asked. Detective Ahn called me an hour later to say Richard had been charged with violating a court order. He'd be released on bail, but the violation would go on his record and help our divorce case significantly. Scarlett called that evening sounding pleased. She said Richard's inability to follow court orders made him look unstable and would strengthen my position in settlement negotiations. Judges didn't like people who violated restraining orders, especially when the violation was documented on security cameras. Scarlett said we could use this to argue that Richard was a danger to my well-being and Claire's. She was already drafting new motions to request Richard stay even further away and to expedite the divorce proceedings. The violation also meant Richard's lawyer would have a harder time painting him as a reasonable person who just wanted his fair share. Scarlett said Richard had basically handed us ammunition by showing up at my workplace and making a scene. She asked if I was okay, and I said yes, even though my hands were still shaking. Maurice had made me tea and sat with me until I calmed down. He said everyone in the office was on my side, and if Richard showed up again, he'd personally make sure security threw him out faster. The district attorney's office called the next week. The prosecutor assigned to Claire's identity theft case said they'd decided to file criminal charges against Richard for fraud and identity theft. The evidence was overwhelming with the forged signatures and Richard's own documentation of his scheme. The prosecutor said Richard was looking at potential jail time, though more likely he'd get probation if he accepted a plea deal. The charges would be filed within days, and Richard would be formally arraigned. Claire would need to testify if the case went to trial, but the prosecutor thought Richard would take a deal rather than face a jury. I thanked her and asked what this meant for us. She said it meant Richard would have a criminal record and would be required to pay restitution to Claire for the credit damage. It also meant he'd be supervised by the court system, and any future violations would result in immediate jail time. The prosecutor said she'd seen cases like this before where parents exploited their children financially, and she was glad we'd reported it. Richard's parents called Amy's house that night. Amy answered, and I could hear Richard's mother's voice through the phone demanding to talk to me. Amy said I wasn't available and didn't want contact with Richard's family. His mother said I was destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding, and I needed to drop the charges. Amy laughed and said Richard destroyed his own life by committing crimes against a teenager. His mother started crying and saying Richard was a good man who just made mistakes. Amy cut her off and suggested they hire their son a better lawyer because he was going to need one. Then she hung up. Richard's father called back immediately, and Amy didn't answer. They called 6 more times that night, and Amy blocked their number. She told me later that Richard's parents had always enabled his behavior and couldn't accept that their son was the problem. Amy said they'd probably blame me for everything just like Richard did. I was right about Richard's parents blaming me for everything. 3 weeks later, Claire got a letter in the mail from a scholarship foundation she'd applied to back in January. The envelope was thin, and I watched her face fall when she opened it, expecting a rejection. Instead, she pulled out a single page and started reading with her eyes getting wider. She looked up at me with this huge smile and said she'd been accepted to the Preston Academic Excellence Scholarship, which covered $15,000 per year for 4 years. I hugged her, and she was shaking with excitement because this was real money that would actually help. 2 days after that, another letter came from the Women in STEM Foundation offering her $12,000 per year. Claire called me at work crying happy tears because between these 2 scholarships, most of her tuition was covered. The third acceptance came from a local medical society that gave scholarships to pre-med students who wrote essays about overcoming challenges. Claire had written about financial manipulation and escaping control, and they awarded her $8,000 for her first year. She was thrilled and kept reading the acceptance letters over and over like she couldn't believe they were real. All 3 organizations wanted to meet her and take photos for their websites, and Claire felt proud instead of ashamed for the first time in months. Jeremy called that weekend, and Claire told him about the scholarships. He listened and then said he wanted to cover her remaining expenses, including books and living costs and campus fees. Claire tried to say no because it was too much, but Jeremy cut her off and explained this wasn't charity or him trying to buy her love. He said he'd been a terrible father for years, giving minimal child support and showing up for maybe half her birthdays. He'd let me carry the full weight of raising her while he lived his comfortable bachelor life. Now she needed help, and he actually had money saved up because he hadn't been spending it on his kid like he should have been. Claire got quiet and then asked if he was sure. Jeremy said he'd never been more sure of anything, and this was him finally being the dad he should have been all along. Claire accepted and thanked him, and they talked for another hour about her college plans and which classes she was most excited about. And I could hear Jeremy's voice through the phone sounding more engaged than I'd heard him in years. After she hung up, Claire looked at me and said her dad was really trying. I agreed and felt grateful that Jeremy was stepping up even if it took Richard's awfulness to make it happen. The divorce mediation happened on a Wednesday morning at Scarlett's office. Richard showed up in a suit looking like he was going to a job interview. His lawyer was a tired-looking man who kept checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who'd clearly done thousands of these meetings. She laid out the ground rules and asked us each to state what we wanted from the divorce. I said I wanted to keep everything I'd owned before the marriage, split marital assets fairly, and have Richard stay away from Claire permanently. Richard's lawyer nodded along, taking notes. Then Richard started talking and claimed he deserved spousal support because he'd sacrificed his career to help raise Claire. The mediator looked confused and asked what career he'd sacrificed. Richard said he could have taken a promotion that required travel, but he'd turned it down to be home for his stepdaughter. Scarlett pulled out Richard's employment records showing he'd worked the exact same job at the same company our entire marriage with 0 promotion offers. She also had his tax returns proving his income had stayed flat the whole time. Richard's lawyer looked embarrassed and told Richard to stop talking. Richard ignored him and kept going, saying he'd put his life on hold to be a father figure. Scarlett showed the mediator Claire's written statement about how Richard had never acted like a father and had actively tried to control her future for his own benefit. The mediator's expression shifted from neutral to annoyed. She asked Richard directly if he had any evidence of career sacrifice, and he couldn't provide anything. His lawyer finally stepped in and said they'd withdraw the spousal support request. Then Richard started demanding half the value of everything I'd brought into the marriage. He wanted half my grandmother's jewelry that I'd inherited years before I even met him. He wanted half the furniture from my first marriage. He wanted half the value of my car that I'd bought with my own money before we got married. The mediator looked at Richard like he was stupid and explained that premarital property stays with the original owner. That's basic divorce law, and his lawyer should have told him that already. Richard's lawyer shifted in his seat and said they were just exploring all options. Scarlett pulled out documentation showing the jewelry had been mine for over a decade with photos and insurance records. She had the car title in my name only from before our marriage. She had receipts for furniture purchased during my first marriage. Everything was clearly documented as mine. The mediator told Richard he had no claim to any of it and needed to focus on actual marital assets. Richard got red in the face and started arguing that he'd maintained the jewelry and driven the car and used the furniture, so he deserved something. His lawyer actually put his hand on Richard's arm and told him to be quiet. The mediator said we were taking a break and everyone needed to calm down. After the break, we worked out the actual settlement. I kept everything I'd owned before marriage, which was most of what I cared about. We split the money in our joint accounts 50-50, which was fair. We split the value of items we'd bought together during the marriage. Richard got nothing related to Claire, including no claim on any future earnings or support. The mediator made that extremely clear, and had Richard acknowledge out loud that he understood he had 0 rights to anything involving my daughter. Richard's lawyer told him to sign because going to court would cost more in legal fees than he'd gain, and a judge would give him even less after seeing his behavior. Richard signed the papers with his jaw clenched. Scarlett told me later that his lawyer had probably advised him from the start that he had no case, but Richard had insisted on trying anyway. The divorce would be final in 60 days once the paperwork processed through the court system. The criminal case moved forward faster than I expected. The prosecutor called and said Richard's lawyer had approached them about a plea deal. Richard wanted to avoid trial because the evidence against him was overwhelming, and a jury would definitely convict him. The prosecutor offered 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and full restitution to Claire for the credit damage. Richard would also have to attend financial counseling and have no contact with Claire or me beyond what the divorce required. The prosecutor said this was a good deal for us because it guaranteed consequences without putting Claire through a trial. She asked what I thought, and I said I wanted whatever gave Claire the most protection and peace. The prosecutor said the plea deal did that, and she'd recommend the judge accept it. 2 weeks later, Richard stood in court and pleaded guilty to identity theft. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced him exactly as the prosecutor recommended. Richard had to pay Claire $5,000 in restitution for the credit damage plus court fees. He looked miserable standing there admitting what he'd done. Claire sat next to me in the courtroom and squeezed my hand when the judge announced the sentence. Afterward, the prosecutor told us Richard's probation officer would monitor him closely, and any violation would send him to jail immediately. Claire, Amy, and I moved into our new apartment the first weekend of June. The place was smaller than the house I'd shared with Richard, but it had 2 bedrooms and felt safe. Amy helped us carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs. We spent the whole day unpacking and arranging furniture. Claire set up her room with her desk facing the window so she could see the park across the street. I hung my grandmother's jewelry in my bedroom and felt relieved it was somewhere Richard could never touch it. That night, we ordered pizza and sat on the floor because we hadn't set up the living room furniture yet. Amy brought paint samples and we spent an hour picking colors for each room. Claire wanted her room sage green. I picked a soft blue for mine. Amy suggested warm yellow for the kitchen. We celebrated with cheap wine that Amy brought and talked about how different everything felt. The apartment was ours completely, with no trace of Richard anywhere. Claire said she felt like she could finally breathe. I knew exactly what she meant. I went to the courthouse the next week and filed paperwork to change my name back to my maiden name. The clerk was nice and processed everything quickly. She said the legal name change would take about 6 weeks. I felt lighter walking out of the building knowing I wouldn't be carrying Richard's name anymore. That evening, I sat with Claire and told her she never had to see or speak to Richard again if she didn't want to. The divorce was final, the criminal case was closed, and she was legally free from any obligation to him. Claire looked relieved and said she definitely didn't want contact. She said Richard had tried to steal her future and she couldn't forgive that. I told her she didn't have to forgive him. Some things people do are unforgivable and she had every right to cut him out completely. Claire hugged me and said she was glad we'd left that night. She said staying would have destroyed both of us. My therapy session with Peyton the following week focused on guilt. I kept thinking about how I hadn't seen Richard's true nature sooner and how I'd brought him into Claire's life. Peyton listened and then explained that financial abusers are skilled manipulators who hide their behavior carefully until they have control established. She said Richard had probably been calculating and planning from the day we met, but he'd hidden it behind normal relationship behavior. The red flags I'd missed weren't obvious because he'd been deliberately concealing them. Peyton said abusers are experts at seeming reasonable and loving until their victim is trapped. She told me I'd done exactly the right thing by leaving the moment I understood what was happening. Most people in my situation would have tried to fix the marriage or given Richard another chance. I'd protected Claire immediately, and that took strength. Peyton said I needed to stop punishing myself for not having information I couldn't have had. Richard had fooled me on purpose, and that wasn't my failure. It was his crime. Claire started college in late August, living at home with me and commuting to campus. Her first day, she came home excited about her pre-med classes and the people she'd met. She joined a study group for biology and made friends with 2 other girls who were also pre-med. She went to campus events and joined clubs. She started dating a guy from her chemistry class who seemed nice and respectful. I watched her become the person she was supposed to be without Richard's voice in her head, telling her relationships were distractions. She was focused and driven, but also happy and social. She called Jeremy once a week to update him on classes, and he came to visit twice that semester to take her to dinner. Their relationship kept improving, and Claire said she was glad her dad was finally being present. I agreed, and felt grateful that something good had come from the nightmare with Richard. Claire was thriving and free and building the future she deserved. Jeremy started showing up every Tuesday for dinner, and we fell into an easy routine where he'd bring takeout and Claire would update him on her classes. He came to her first college presentation in October, and sat next to me in the auditorium taking pictures on his phone like any proud parent would. After the presentation, he took us both out for ice cream, and Claire talked nonstop about her biology professor who was doing research on genetic markers. Jeremy listened to every word and asked good questions, and I watched them connect in ways they never had when she was younger. He called me one evening to ask if it was okay that he was coming around so much, and I told him Claire needed her father in her life, and I was glad he was stepping up. We worked out a schedule where he'd take Claire to dinner once a week without me, so they could have their own relationship separate from co-parenting logistics. It felt good to see my daughter have both her parents actively involved and supportive, instead of one checked-out parent and one exhausted single mom doing everything alone. Maurice knocked on my office door in early November with 3 other coworkers from my department. They wanted to take me out to celebrate the divorce being finalized, and I agreed because I hadn't done anything social with work people in over a year. We went to a restaurant downtown and ordered appetizers and drinks, and Maurice raised his glass to toast my freedom. Then he admitted they'd all been worried about me during my marriage because I'd stopped joining them for lunch and always seemed stressed. Sarah from accounting said she'd noticed I was losing weight and seemed jumpy whenever my phone rang. Tom from sales mentioned he'd met Richard at the holiday party 2 years ago and thought Richard asked too many questions about my salary and job security. They'd all seen signs something was wrong but didn't know how to bring it up without overstepping boundaries or making things worse for me. I thanked them for caring enough to worry and told them I wished I'd recognized the red flags myself before things got as bad as they did. Maurice said abusers are good at isolating their victims and making everything seem normal from the outside. The evening felt healing in a way I hadn't expected because I realized I had people in my corner who genuinely cared about my well-being. My boss called me into her office the week before Thanksgiving, and I walked in expecting some kind of problem. Instead, she told me the company was promoting me to senior account manager with a significant raise and expanded responsibilities. She said I'd seemed more focused and confident over the past few months, and my work quality had improved noticeably. I thanked her and walked back to my desk feeling stunned, because I hadn't realized how much Richard's constant criticism had been affecting my job performance. He used to tell me I was terrible with clients and barely competent at my job, and I'd started believing him, without his voice in my head telling me I was failing at everything I'd apparently been excelling at work. The raise meant I could afford a slightly bigger apartment, or start saving for a house down payment, and I felt proud of myself for the first time in years. Maurice hugged me when I told him about the promotion, and said he'd known I had it in me all along. Claire came home from campus one afternoon in early December looking nervous and asked if we could talk. She sat down at the kitchen table and told me there was a guy in her biology study group who'd asked her out for coffee. She wanted to know what I thought about dating because Richard had spent 3 years telling her relationships would ruin her career, and she wasn't sure what was healthy anymore. I sat down across from her and explained that healthy relationships involved respect and support, rather than control and calculation. I told her the right person would encourage her goals and celebrate her successes instead of trying to limit her potential for their own benefit. Claire asked how you could tell the difference between someone genuinely caring about you and someone manipulating you. I said to trust her instincts and watch for red flags like someone who tried to isolate her from friends or family, or someone who kept score of everything they did for her. She nodded and said the guy from her study group seemed nice and respectful, and she thought she'd say yes to coffee. I hugged her and told her I was proud of her for asking questions and thinking critically, instead of just accepting someone else's rules about her life. The first restitution payment from Richard arrived in mid-December as a check for $200. Claire took it to the bank and deposited it directly into her college savings account, without even considering spending it on anything else. She came home and told me it felt good that Richard was finally contributing properly to her education, instead of pretending his grocery receipts counted as supporting her. The payments were court-ordered to continue monthly until he'd paid back the full amount he owed her for the identity theft and credit damage. Claire said every check felt like validation that what Richard did was wrong and illegal rather than just bad parenting. She started a spreadsheet tracking the payments and calculating how many months until the debt was fully repaid. I watched her take control of the situation in a mature way and felt grateful she hadn't let Richard's manipulation destroy her sense of self-worth or financial responsibility. Amy called in January to say she'd started dating someone new and wanted to introduce him to us at a family dinner. We drove to her house the following Saturday and met Tom, who worked as a contractor, and seemed genuinely kind and interested in Amy's opinions. He asked Claire about college and listened to her answers without trying to calculate her future earning potential. He helped clear the table after dinner and joked with Amy in the kitchen in a way that felt comfortable and equal. I watched them together and recognized how abnormal my marriage to Richard had been compared to what a healthy relationship actually looked like. Tom treated Amy like a partner rather than a resource to exploit. He supported her career goals without trying to control them. He split the check when they went out instead of keeping receipts to hold over her head later. Watching my sister in a functional relationship helped me understand that Richard's behavior wasn't just bad, but actually abusive in ways I'd been minimizing to myself. Maurice set me up on a blind date in February with his friend from college who was recently divorced and new to the area. We met for dinner at an Italian place downtown and talked about work and kids and recovery from bad marriages. The conversation flowed easily without me feeling like I had to watch every word or calculate whether I was saying the right thing. He paid for dinner without making a big deal about it and walked me to my car without expecting anything in return. The date didn't lead anywhere romantic because we didn't have that spark, but I enjoyed having adult conversation without walking on eggshells or worrying about saying something that would trigger criticism later. Driving home, I realized how exhausting my marriage had been and how much energy I'd wasted trying to manage Richard's moods and expectations. Dating someone normal helped me recalibrate what reasonable adult interaction actually felt like. Claire's first semester grades came in early January, and she'd made the dean's list with a perfect grade point average. Jeremy called to say he wanted to throw her a celebration dinner and invited me to join them at a nice restaurant near campus. We sat at a table by the window, and Jeremy gave Claire a card with money for textbooks next semester. She thanked him and talked about her classes and her plans for sophomore year and how much she loved her biology research position. Jeremy looked proud and asked good questions and treated her like the accomplished young woman she was becoming. I watched Claire thrive academically and socially without Richard's pressure to maximize earning potential hanging over her head. She'd joined clubs and made friends and started dating that guy from her study group who turned out to be respectful and supportive. Everything Richard said would ruin her career had actually made her happier and more successful. Detective On called in March to inform me that Richard had violated his probation terms by trying to access Claire's credit report without permission. The credit monitoring service we'd set up after the identity theft caught the unauthorized inquiry and reported it to his probation officer. Richard claimed he was just checking to make sure Claire was managing her credit responsibly, but the judge didn't buy that excuse. Detective On said Richard received additional penalties, including extended probation and mandatory financial counseling. The violation would be noted in his record, and any future probation violations could result in jail time. I thanked Detective On and felt relieved that the system was actually holding Richard accountable for continuing to try to control Claire's financial life. Claire was 18 now and legally entitled to privacy that Richard kept trying to violate. Peyton and I worked through my remaining trust issues during our sessions in late March and early April. She helped me identify specific red flags I'd missed with Richard, like how he'd isolated me from friends by creating financial emergencies that prevented social activities. She pointed out green flags to look for in future relationships, like someone who respected my boundaries and supported my independence rather than trying to control my choices. Peyton gave me homework assignments to practice trusting my own judgment in small decisions and noticing when I second-guessed myself unnecessarily. We talked about how Richard had undermined my confidence systematically over 3 years, until I stopped trusting my own perceptions of reality. She helped me understand that recovering from that kind of manipulation took took time and conscious effort to rebuild my sense of self. By our final session, I felt ready to trust myself again and recognized that Richard's abuse reflected his character flaws rather than my inadequacy. I found a local organization that helped people escape financial abuse through Amy's recommendation. The coordinator asked if I'd be willing to share my story at their monthly support group, and I agreed even though talking about Richard still made my chest tight. The first meeting I attended had 12 women sitting in a circle, and when I explained how Richard had tried to turn Claire into his retirement fund, one woman started crying because her husband had done something similar to her son. I talked about the spreadsheets and the debt folder and how he'd sabotaged Claire's credit, and 3 more women nodded like they recognized the pattern. After the meeting, 4 people asked for my contact information because they wanted advice on protecting their kids financially. The coordinator pulled me aside and asked if I'd consider volunteering regularly to help others navigate the legal and financial steps of leaving. I started going twice a month to share resources and listen to people's stories, and it felt good to turn what Richard did to us into something that helped other families. Claire came home from her biology class in late April talking about career paths in medicine. She'd been considering surgery or research, but now she wanted to look into family medicine because she met a doctor who worked with vulnerable populations. We sat at the kitchen table while she showed me information about family medicine residencies and community health centers and how doctors could advocate for patients dealing with abuse or poverty. She told me that watching me stand up to Richard taught her that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help people who can't help themselves. I listened to her talk about wanting to work in underserved areas and provide care to people who faced barriers to healthcare, and I realized my daughter had turned Richard's attempt to control her into motivation to protect others. She was building the career she wanted for the right reasons, instead of the ones Richard tried to force on her. Jeremy called and asked if we could meet for coffee without Claire. I met him at a place near his office, and he looked nervous, stirring his drink for a full minute before talking. He apologized for not being more involved when Claire was younger, and said he took the easy way out by just sending child support, instead of actually being a father. Watching Richard try to exploit Claire made him realize he'd abandoned his daughter when she needed him, and he was ashamed it took someone else hurting her to wake him up. He said he wanted to do better, and asked if I thought Claire would ever forgive him for all the years he wasn't there. I told him what mattered was that he showed up when it counted, and that Claire needed her dad now more than she needed an apology for the past. Jeremy thanked me and said our co-parenting relationship now was better than our marriage ever was, because we were both focused on Claire instead of our own problems. Jeremy and I worked out a better schedule for Claire to spend time with him, and he started coming to more of her college events. Claire seemed happier having both her parents actively involved in her life, and I was glad Jeremy finally stepped up. Our communication about Claire's needs and schedules became easy and natural, instead of the tense exchanges we'd had for years. I realized we were better at supporting Claire as co-parents than we'd ever been as a married couple. Richard's probation officer called my cell phone in early May. She needed to verify that Richard was staying away from us per his probation terms, and asked if we'd had any contact. I confirmed we'd had 0 contact since his arrest for violating the restraining order, and that we wanted it to stay that way permanently. The probation officer thanked me and said Richard was required to check in monthly, and she wanted to make sure he was following all the court orders. She gave me her direct number and told me to call immediately if Richard tried to contact us in any way. I saved her number and felt reassured that someone was monitoring Richard's behavior. Claire and I decided to host Thanksgiving at our apartment instead of going to Amy's house this year. We invited Amy and Jeremy and a few close friends, including Maurice from my work. Claire made a detailed shopping list, and we spent the day before cooking together and setting up the table with decorations she'd bought. Jeremy arrived first with wine and flowers, and Amy brought her famous sweet potato casserole. Maurice showed up with his partner and a homemade pie. We squeezed around the table, and Claire led a toast thanking everyone for supporting us through the hardest year of our lives. The conversation flowed easily with laughter and stories, and nobody mentioned Richard once. I looked around at people who genuinely cared about us, and realized this was the first holiday that felt happy and relaxed in years. I met someone new in June through my volunteer work at the Financial Abuse Organization. He was a lawyer who did pro bono work for their clients, and we started talking after a support group meeting about the legal complexities of financial abuse cases. He asked if I wanted to get coffee and discuss some resources that might help the people I was working with. We met twice more before he admitted the coffee meetings weren't really about work, and asked if I'd like to have dinner sometime. I said yes, and was surprised by how easy the conversation felt, and how he asked questions about my life, and actually listened to the answers. We started dating casually, and I noticed he respected my boundaries and never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with. Healthy relationships felt so different from what I'd had with Richard. Maurice got promoted to department manager at work in July. He threw a small celebration and joked that the department was full of strong women who didn't take nonsense from anyone. He told me privately that watching me stand up for myself and leave Richard had changed the office culture because other people saw they didn't have to accept bad treatment either. 2 other women in our department had left toxic relationships in the past year, and Maurice said my example showed them it was possible. I felt proud that something good came from the worst experience of my life. Claire's freshman year grades arrived in early August, and she'd finished with a perfect grade point average. She got an email inviting her to join a competitive research program that only accepted 10 students from the entire university. The program would give her hands-on experience in medical research and look excellent on her medical school applications. Claire was thrilled and immediately accepted the position. She was building exactly the future she wanted without Richard's interference or pressure to maximize her earning potential. Watching her thrive made every difficult moment of leaving Richard worth it. Amy came over in late August and we sat on the balcony drinking iced tea. She told me she was proud of how far I'd come from that scared woman who showed up at her door with garbage bags full of belongings. I thought about everything that happened since that night we escaped and realized I was proud of myself too. I protected Claire from Richard's exploitation and rebuilt our lives into something better than what we had before. We were safe and happy and surrounded by people who actually cared about us. Richard's plan to use Claire as his retirement fund had failed completely, and we'd created the future we deserved instead. Our apartment lease came up for renewal in September, and Claire brought it up over dinner. She'd been looking at rental listings and suggested we consider a small house instead of renewing. We started searching online that weekend and found a 3-bedroom place with a fenced yard about 15 minutes from campus. The rent was only $200 more than our apartment, and the landlord was willing to work with our move-in timeline. We toured it on a Saturday morning and both fell in love with the bright kitchen and the way sunlight filled the living room. The extra bedroom meant Claire could have a proper study space separate from where she slept. We signed the lease that afternoon and felt like we were starting something completely new and permanent. Jeremy offered to help with the move when Claire told him about the house. He showed up early on moving day with his truck, and we loaded furniture and boxes for 6 hours. Amy came too and brought lunch for everyone. By evening, we had everything moved in, and Jeremy stayed for pizza while we unpacked the kitchen. Claire looked around at all of us sitting on the floor, eating and laughing about furniture that wouldn't fit through doorways. She told me later that night this was exactly what she'd always wanted growing up. A house full of family who actually cared about each other without tension or walking on eggshells. My final therapy session with Peyton happened in October. She reviewed the progress I'd made over the past year and said I'd done remarkable work transforming trauma into strength. Peyton gave me tools and strategies to maintain my mental health going forward and reminded me I could always come back if I needed support. She told me I should be proud of how far I'd come from that terrified woman who first walked into her office. I graduated from therapy with confidence that I could handle whatever came next. 2 years had passed since that night we escaped with garbage bags full of belongings and drove to Amy's house. Claire and I were thriving in our new house with its sunny kitchen and fenced yard. She was excelling in her pre-med program with perfect grades and meaningful research experience. I'd gotten promoted twice at work and was dating someone who treated me with genuine respect and kindness. We'd built a life surrounded by people who actually cared about us instead of calculating what they could extract from us. Richard's elaborate plan to use Claire as his retirement fund had failed completely. Instead of supporting his retirement, Claire was building her own future on her own terms. Instead of being trapped in a controlling marriage, I had independence and healthy relationships. We'd created exactly the future we deserved.